And he seduced them that dwell on the earth for the signs which were given him to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make the image of the beast, which had the wound by the sword and lived. All right, so that's the objection response. The argument proves too much and inclines toward the abrogation of faith in the miracles of Christ and the apostles. Their miracles can be distinguished from the operation of Satan, or they cannot. If they can, then why not other miracles which have been performed in subsequent centuries? If they cannot, then Christ would have said absurdly, if you do not want to believe me, then believe the works. The works always meant the signs also meaning the miracles. Right, so no matter which, in other words, if you say A, that's wrong. If you say B, that's wrong. That's a dilemma, which is the most powerful logical argument, is the dilemma. In other words, against your opponent. But you have to make sure that your dilemma is tight, because if there's a third possibility, you're dead. But if your dilemma is, you'll learn that in logic, it's devastating. I'll give you a dilemma. If Leo is the Pope, the Society of St. Pius X is wrong. It's schismatic, actually, if he is the Pope. If he is not the Pope, it is schismatic. Well, either way. So, in other words, if he is the Pope, then they are in schism because they have an organized disobedience to him in everything that pertains to his universal authority. He's not saying to them, go out and rob a bank for me. So you could resist the Pope on that level, but not for universal liturgy and doctrine, etc. You can't, no. So that's considered schismatic. That's in that supplement. Pius IX said that. It's schismatic even before a declaration. So Pius IX says in the supplement. Did I give you the supplement? Yeah, I did. Okay, it's in there. And so, as a matter of fact, it's right here. So that's a dilemma. If A, you're wrong. If B, you're wrong. So you're wrong. That's the dilemma. That's the most powerful of arguments. So let me see where he says that. Pius that's Leo the 13th. Pius the 9th. For the Catholic Church has always considered schismatic all those who obstinately resist the authority of her legitimate prelates, and especially her supreme pastor. No one under any pretext can believe them innocent of the sin of schism, even if they had not been denounced as schismatic by apostolic authority. Those who resist then he says above, the neo-schismatics say that there is no question of dogma, but only of discipline. Pius IX. So. There's something against conclavism here. No one is ignorant of the fact that, this is Pius IX, that the Catholic Church has always reproved this teaching, that the people have never had, either by divine right or by ecclesiastical right, the power to elect bishops or other ministers of divine worship. So that's that. All right, so I distinguish the proof of the minor miracles can be performed by evil people in testimony of the truth I concede. In confirmation of error, I subdistinguish. False miracles I concede. True ones I deny. The true miracle, since it transcends the whole order of created nature, is done by God alone, who cannot be a witness to falsehood. Indeed, the signs of the false prophets in sacred scripture are called lies. Instance, St. Augustine said of miracles, whatever such things happen in the Catholic Church are to be approved, because they happen in the Catholic Church. The Church is not therefore manifested because these things happen in it. All right, so this is the objection. Therefore, sanctity cannot be one of the marks. Response, I distinguish the antecedents. St. Augustine speaks in such a way, respectively, I concede, absolutely, I deny. Since the Donatists, that was the schismatic group at the time of St. Augustine, were boasting of their fathers, their councils, and their miracles, St. Augustine, in order to close off their escape, said that even if all of these are taken away, one must look at the Catholicity and universality of the Church. See, something that the Donatists could not brag about. For in such a way, the Donatists were most evidently confounded, asserting that the Church of Christ was founded in Africa alone, Northern Africa. Furthermore, Augustine held the charism of miracles to be so important in the Retractationes, Book 113. He believes that he must very explicitly declare that the miracles were not confined to the early church, but that they would continue in subsequent centuries, which they did. Right, so that's that. That's the holiness of the church. Article 4. Whether the Catholic Church, Church of Christ is Catholic. So Catholic here means universal. Obviously, the Catholic Church is Catholic, but it doesn't have universality. So, definition of the notion of Catholicity: the mark of Catholicity is that property of the Church by which it flows out to the whole world as conspicuously numerous and everywhere one. So, it has a vocation from Christ to preach the gospel to the entire world, all right? And where it is numerous, it attracts many people to it, but it is everywhere one, you see? So although there is a tremendous diversity of population and peoples, etc., there is a oneness of doctrine, a oneness of discipline, oneness of authority, you see? So that's both. Both are, it's unum versus alia. That's one thing with regard to other things. That's where you get the word universal. Unum versus alia. See that? So it's one thing with regard to many things. See, so the Catholic religion is the same everywhere, but it is in very, very diverse places. So the word Catholic is taken from the Greek katholon, kata, and the th on that is because of the breathing on holon, according to the whole. That's where it comes from. It means universal in Greek. For the Church can be said to be Catholic or universal, A, by the Catholicity of place, because it is throughout the whole world. B, by Catholicity of persons, because it embraces many and rejects no one. So it's not a Church of England, for example. Church of England. How do you promulgate the Church of England to non-English? It makes no sense whatsoever. Church of Canada, that's what it is. And, the Church of Scotland, they have Church of Ireland. Or the Eastern rites typically are very, very attached to their cultures. In other words, it's so embedded in the culture that you would have to learn, to like baklava if you wanted to become Greek Orthodox. In other words, it is totally imbued with Greek. You see, whereas the Catholic Church, is not. It's not an Italian church. It's not As a matter of fact, it adapts to various cultures. For example, Catholicism in England would be very different culturally, you might say, or by tastes, than Catholicism in Spain. You're not going to see those big processions with the Virgin Mary flowers and everything, as you do in Spain, with these very, very elaborate things. In England, you're not going to see that ever, So the British are cold, and that's not a criticism, but they are just more reserved, you might say. And so Catholicism has a certain flavor in each country. It's like ice cream. In other words, it's the same thing, but there's a certain flavor of it in each country. In France or Germany or Austria, it adapts very nicely to where it is, but it's all the same essentially. You see, and Southern peoples tend to be more emotional. And like for the Italian ladies, when they would walk through a church, they would see the stained glass windows or the statues. They would blow kisses at it like this. It was typical of Italian parishes. You'd see the ladies blowing kisses to the, yes, you'd never see that in the Irish churches. So it's just, it adapts easily. Saint Gregory the Great told Saint Augustine of Canterbury when they were converting England, take whatever you can from the local pagans. In other words, if there's anything in it that can be adapted to Catholicism, take it. But otherwise, put aside anything that is improper. But he did tell them that. See, so the church has always been adaptable to cultures, always. But there's a limit to that. You see, there was the Jesuits in the 17th century were heavily criticized by the Pope, let's say the least, for enculturation in the Far East. They were taking too much. In other words, they were adapting too much. And the Dominicans and the Franciscans complained to the Vatican. And yes, the Jesuits were. That was the time of the Chinese Missal. And that was Pope Paul Alexander the Fourth. No, I'm wrong. It was I can't remember his name right now, but he permitted the Chinese Missal, and then it came up for renewal, and Innocent the 11th just didn't bother renewing it. So it was something that was considered not a good idea. So, but he did give permission for the Chinese to recite it in Latin, even though they did not understand Latin. They could say the Mass in Latin if they could pronounce it correctly, even though they did not at that time understand Latin. That was permitted. So anyway, that's the idea. So there's a great deal of diversity in the Catholic Church, but there is one single faith. So by a Catholicity of persons, we said that by a Catholicity of time, because in its present state it will endure from the time of Christ until the end of the world. So it is one thing through all time. And D, by Catholicity of doctrine, by which the whole Church preserves the doctrine of Christ. So you see that these things do not pertain to the Novus Ordo, which should make you draw a conclusion. Nevertheless, Catholicity of time does not seem to pertain to the mark of Catholicity, as it is a mark in other words, as a mark in the strict sense, as the essence of mark is considered, since it refers partially to the Church's perpetuity and partly to its apostolicity. Those are other the perpetuity. Those are other marks and characteristics of the Church. The perpetuity pertains to indefectibility. The same must be said for Catholicity of doctrine, since it is precisely by means of the marks that it is made known where the integral totality of Christian doctrine can be found. So that would be circular. In other words, it is by the marks that you know that it is the true church. If you said it's by doctrine, then you're reasoning in a circular manner. So that's all it's saying. It is said to be a property of the Church, for it does not concern just any kind of universality, for example, that of Buddhism or Mohammedanism, which has a certain universality. Coca-Cola has universality. It does. McDonald's has universality. Go anywhere. I saw when I was in Moscow, there was McDonald's spelled in Cyrillic. Yes. I mean, they were everywhere. I don't think they're there anymore. But no, that's universality. It's the same thing everywhere. Although in France, they make the hamburgers conform to all of their rules of food, and it's a lot better in France than it is here. right? So if you ever go to France, don't worry about it. I don't know how you feel about McDonald's, but the young people usually think it's wonderful. So it's a Catholicity which Christ promised to his church. So it's this, you might say, a special kind. The words conspicuously numerous are added in order to signify not that all men will join the church, but that multitude is required by which the Church of Christ, by its fecundity and majesty of its numbers, can be discerned from sects. See, so nothing ever came close to it in numbers. So the Protestantism, Orthodoxy, etc., nothing ever came close to it in numbers. And it had a tremendous energy for missionary work. I mean, as soon as the New World was discovered, the priests were on those ships going out. It was Spain, Portugal, the priests all. So, so flows out into the world. This means not an expansion which is physically universal, but morally, that is an expansion which corresponds to the nature of the church and to its divine institutions. For the church did not immediately penetrate the whole world. See, the Roman world was and some India was known by the Romans. They imported some very nice things from India, but China was, they knew there was something there, but they never got into China. But there was trade between the Roman Empire and India, and St. Thomas went to India and died there. And St. Matthew went to, he died in Parthia, which is a present-day Iraq and Iran. So, I mean, they went into those areas that were not Roman Empire. But they went throughout the Roman Empire. But, the whole planet. But it had that power and intention. In other words, wherever there were Africa, the missionaries went to Africa, they went everywhere as the Europeans discovered more lands. China, St. Francis Xavier, China, Japan, and all of those countries that were in a way like outer space at the time. It took you forever to get there. They had to go around Africa to get to the Far East and South America and all of those remote areas which were very hard to get to. So a tremendous energy to do that at the command of Christ. And that martyr that we have in the hallway there, he was put to death in what is now Vietnam, but was part of China at the time. He was 27 years old, I think. That big relic that's in the hallway. Hello, that big.
Yes.
You'll have a look on your face like you've never seen it. You can't miss it. You might bang your head on it and walking down the hall in the dark. Yes, he was a young man. They chopped off his head and then threw the body into the river, and the Catholics fished it out. But by the time of Pius XI, this was written before Pius XI, the whole world was, they got into the islands and the Pacific everywhere, so really the whole world had been, the gospel had been preached to the whole world. Under the reign of Pius XI, there was a tremendous emphasis on missions. It is of the greatest importance when we say, and everywhere one. Indeed, if unity is lacking, then a Catholic church is not seen, but churches condemned to a counterfeit Catholicity. For material Catholicity is of no use, but formal is required. See, for this reason, St. Thomas says, one and the same thing is that which is believed by all the faithful. See, so merely a Catholicity of institution is not sufficient for the mark of Catholicity, but formal, that means one and the same faith believed by all. Very important. Therefore, it is said to be one or universal. And because the unity of faith cannot even be conceived of if you take away a single ruler, as it is clear as day that the mark of Catholicity depends on a certain center of ecclesiastical unity. So the papacy is the center of unity and the principle of unity of the whole Catholic Church. You can't have one thing, oneness of doctrine, oneness of discipline, etc., all the things that make the Church Catholic, unless you have a single authority dictating that. You can make all the applications. From what has been said, it is apparent that Catholicity does not consist simply in the right to preach everywhere, but in the fact of its outpouring. See, the Catholic Church always claimed the right to go preach the gospel everywhere. And that's why in the colonial times, the priests would go and they were protected by the soldiers of Spain or Portugal, as the case may be, in preaching the gospel, because sometimes the natives were a little hostile. But they had the right to go in. That was the divine command to go in. They had the right to go in and preach. And many times they were martyred. The North American martyrs, awful martyrdoms that they had at the hands of the Indians, the Iroquois, who Saint Jean de Brébeuf, he had his heart pulled out by the chief, and the chief ate his heart because he was undergoing a very painful. They baptized him in boiling water as a mock baptism. They put tomahawk heads, the part that cuts. They made a necklace of it, and they put those in the fire and then put it around his neck. That's Jean de Brébeuf. And then, see, he wasn't giving in on that. He wasn't screaming or anything like that. And so they thought he's very brave. So they cut his chest, and he put his hand in, pulled out his heart, Saint John de Brébeuf, and they burned him. That was one of the martyrs of today. We should read that book in the refectory if you can stomach it. The things that they went through in order to bring the gospel to the Indians. And they burned the whole village, which you can see in Canada today. They reconstructed the village that they built in Canada. And they went back to Quebec, virtually a complete failure. The mission was virtually a complete failure. The Iroquois came and killed most of the Hurons. The Hurons were the nice Indians. Burned down everything that they built, the whole kind of fort that they built, the priests, with the help of the Indians, burned it all down, and they went back to Quebec. The survivors, a few Indians and a few priests, went back to Quebec in about 2 canoes, and that was the end of that mission. But still, it shows the church's energy and its fidelity to its mission to preach the gospel. Yes.
I know at least one of the North American martyrs, but I'm pretty sure a few of them, the Indians cut their thumb and pointer finger off because they knew that that's how they said mass.
St. Isaac Jogues, and he got permission to say mass that way.
Yes.
And he went back to France after that. And the other, young people that saw that were inspired to go back to Canada, seeing his wounds from the Iroquois Indians. They were inspired to do it, and 1 ship in 7 sank at that time when you were going to the New World. 1 in 7. Now imagine if you went to the airport and 1 in 7 planes would crash. Think about that. So they were dead men when they got on the ship. In other words, I have a strong chance of not making it. Very strong chance of not making it. That's how brave they were. I wish some of the young men today would be as responsive. So, but it was all out of love of God, pure love of God, nothing in it for themselves, and many of them came from relatively comfortable families and whatnot. So, anyway, So, from what has been said, it is apparent that Catholicity does not consist simply in the right to preach everywhere, but in the fact of this outpouring. But beware not to take this fact too mechanically or mathematically, as if the expansive vitality of the church would not be subject to the movements of the ups and downs, which correspond to divine help and attacks of the gates of hell. So sometimes the local authorities, you might say, were not too happy to receive the missionaries, and sometimes the mission had to come to an end for one reason or another. So that was true in many cases. I mean, that martyr that's in the hallway, and getting into China was difficult. Getting into Japan, they actually crucified many people in Japan, and Catholics in Japan, I think in the 1700s. So they were very hostile. To many of the Indians in this country were hostile. So, the depends on where they went, but they were not always welcome as the flowers in May, as we say. Sometimes they had, but the point was that they made the attempt and eventually succeeded. The requirements for Catholicity. For example, they couldn't get into Russia after Orthodoxy, or so-called Orthodoxy. In other words, the Jesuits were in Russia, though. Belarus has Catholics in it, so the Russian Empire was so spread out. Poland has Catholics in it. That was Russian Empire, so they were tolerated in those Catholic areas, but you couldn't compete with the Russian Orthodox Church. And that's why the Catholic Church, when it was finally penetrated, you might say, Moscow and Russia proper, had to use the Latin Mass and not the Slavonic Mass, because they wanted no competition with the Russian Orthodox Church. So the Catholics always had the Latin Mass in Russia. Anyway, that's kind of interesting. So the requirements for Catholicity, it seems that three things pertain to Catholicity: a conspicuous number of faithful, both absolutely, that is, in itself, and relatively, that is, in comparison with other groups, to whom we attribute the name of Christian Church. B, a real expansion in the whole world and simultaneous, by which the Church at the same time attains all people morally. Successive expansion is not sufficient, by which the Church would be called Catholic, not because of being in many nations at once, but by adding to the nations in which it once was the nations in which it now exists. C, a vitality which does not defect, by which the Church, expelled from one region, is born in another, and is so inexhaustible that the group is ever obvious, to which Christ committed the propagation of his faith. So in general, it has to be a church which is constantly expanding, you might say, despite obstacles and all sorts of other, when new places are discovered, the church gets there very quickly. That's required for Catholicity. The Catholic missionary efforts far exceeded any Protestant missionary efforts. And the Greeks, the Eastern schismatics, hardly did anything. They just kept to themselves pretty much. So, I said, in a conspicuous number of faithful, what of the hypothesis of a greater number of schismatics and heretics than of Catholics? I respond that it is not certain that it could not happen if one is speaking about the material multitude, or of Catholicity without the true modes of Catholicity, but I would deny the possibility if the hypothesis is extended to formal and true Catholicity. For example, that heresy or schism be everywhere and one. See, so heresy and schism are isolated typically. As there has never been any kind of heresy or schism which imitates the oneness of the Catholic Church and its quality of being everywhere. it does not seem that all men of all peoples will come to the true faith, or that there will never be a combination of grain and cockle in the field of the church. You see, so it doesn't mean that the whole world will necessarily convert to the Catholic faith. For this reason, St. Thomas says that the church is called Catholic not because of the members of each people, but because of the people of each of the members. So, in other words, that it is represented in all the peoples of the earth. That's what that means. That everyone has heard about it. There are some that follow it in all the peoples of the earth. Pretty much. No, our Lord said, when I return, will I find faith on the earth? Which all the commentators say, it seems that he will return in a state of apostasy on the face of the earth. So it says in the gospel, will I find faith on the earth? It's a rhetorical question, but the commentators, it seems that he's saying that he will not. But it is not absurd to hope that the church will obtain a greater victory over sin and error, since its power is divine. If now it has come to all nations, it will always be able to gain more for Christ from each of these peoples. There are even some who say that at the end of the expansion, there will be a complete conversion of the world to Christ. And that's Malsebre, an author. But we don't know that. Cardinal Billot, in his treatise on the 7 ages of the church, say that this period that we're in now will be characterized by a general apostasy. That there will be very few who will resist it. I can print that out for you if you want. And that that it will end with the Antichrist. That, in other words, the Antichrist will emerge from this, and that then after him or during his time there will be the conversion of the Jews, and they will usher in a time of great expansion and prosperity for the church that it has never known before. That's what he says. Based on the 7 letters to the 7 churches in the Apocalypse, he and others have interpreted that as 7 ages of the church. And it's very interesting when you read what he says about this age, and he was writing at much earlier time. Maybe he died, I think, in the 1920s or so. So it's I can print that out for you if you want. It's very interesting. The hypothesis of Melchior Canus, he's a famous Thomist theologian, Melchior Canus, concerning Catholicity. Melchior Canus and St. Robert Bellarmine, although they do not affirm that it is possible that merely one province retain the Catholic faith, owing to the rise of heresies and persecutions, nevertheless they state the following regarding the hypothesis of the Christian faith being reduced to the limits of merely one province. He says, it would be sufficient that the church was diffused throughout the whole world at one time in order that it be considered truly Catholic. But the common opinion denies this. Whatever may be said about it, a hypothesis of this kind in no way favors the sects, which could never show communion with the church, which at one time occupied the whole world. So that's a speculation. The system of rationalism of Tübingen, that awful hellhole, concerning the origin of Catholicity. Bauer, and I told you about him, there he is. You can see a picture of him right here. Died in 1860, a professor at Tübingen, Ratzinger, invented a new system which excluded the divine origin of the Christian religion. Furthermore, the school of Tübingen, following Bauer, declared that a certain religious evolution took place in the 1st century, which quite consistently corresponds to the Hegelian laws. Those who are taking De Revelatione will remember. Right. Among other things, it was necessary to assign a cause for the Christian church, precisely as it is Catholic, Two things, therefore, were sought from the conflict of which a third thing would arise: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. We just did this the other day, De Revelatione. Hegel was the evolutionistic philosopher, and he said everything is in becoming. There's no being. Everything's becoming. There's no static being. It's all becoming. And that the way you get development is by conflict of two things, thesis, antithesis, and that goes into a higher synthesis. That's Hegel in a nutshell. And that's really all you have to know, because the rest of it is garbage. All right, that's all you have to know. But he was very, very influential in the 19th century. The 19th century was the century of evolution. Everything's evolving. And even Darwin's evolution really came out of the philosophical evolutionism. See, it was this mentality that everything's changing. So two things, therefore, were sought from the conflict. But supernatural facts, since mysteries and miracles are contrary to pantheistic philosophy, were repudiated by the school a priori. You see, that means, in principle, supernatural facts, mysteries, miracles, it's impossible. But you'll study that in other courses. So when he says, when Christ died, two factions arose, one of which made the use of the gospel of circumcision, and the other the gospel of the foreskin. That means non-circumcision. The latter believed that men were justified through faith in Christ without the works of the Judaic law. St. Paul. They would say that's St. Paul. The former contended that the observance of the Mosaic law was necessary for the justification of men, the Judaizers. The sect of those who stood for the Mosaic law, or Judaizing Christians, is called Petrinism, from their leader Peter. The sect which was the paganizers is called Paulinism, from its leader Paul. These sects progressed thereafter into Ebionitism and Marcionism. So I see that there's that evolution, this rising evolution. Around, they say, around the middle of the 2nd century, Joanism prevailed. Men who were eager for peace congregated most of the followers of each sect by the use of the formula faith with works. Petrinism had as its principle the works of the Judaic law, perfected by Christ. Paulinism had as its principle faith in the redemption which was procured by the death of Christ. Under the common conciliatory formula of faith with works, the Catholic Church emerged. That was his theory. He was a Protestant. Well, Protestant. I don't think he believed anything, but he was not raised in Catholicism or anything like that. But that's how the Catholic Church came about. It's typically modernist. Remember Lavoisier, Christ preached the gospel, and then the church happened. We're going to skip number 5. So thesis, the Church of Christ is Catholic. Argument 1 from the purpose of the church. The purpose of the church is that men be sanctified in it and through it. So salus animarum suprema lex, the supreme law, the salvation of souls is the supreme law. But it is not, now it's the climate is the supreme law. And that's and Mother Earth and Pachamama. All right. But it is necessary that all men be sanctified. From this it follows that the church must be diffused to all peoples. The major is evident from what has been said above, and the conclusion is obvious, for although God is able to use extraordinary means, nevertheless he ordinarily uses the ordinary means, that is, he leads men to true faith and life through the church. So yes, God can knock you off your horse, as he did with St. Paul. He can do that. But he seldom does stuff like that. There are instances in lives of the saints that are similar to that. Very, very, St. Augustine's conversion, for example. Others some sudden and deep conversions. But most of the time it's through missionaries, but God can draw you as he will. He needed St. Paul, so he got him. Oops. St. Matthew. He wanted St. Matthew, but he got him. St. Bede said St. Jerome said that that maybe I gave a sermon on Sunday and I was in Detroit, that Christ's countenance had a certain glow to it that attracted St. Matthew, and that was the reason for his conversion. But it is also true that St. Matthew was working in Capharnaum, where our Lord performed many miracles and preached the gospel a great deal. So he must have been somewhat familiar with our Lord. But St. Bede said what moved him was the interior movement of grace drawing him, which God can do without violating your liberty. And you say, well, how does that happen? St. Augustine said, if you want to avoid error, don't ask. The Thomists say that God is the author of liberty, free will, and is the author of grace. Those two things could never conflict. So somehow he does it. He draws you and does not violate your free will. And there's many cases of that where you say, how does someone convert? How does calling the apostles, they throw down their nets, they follow them. How does that happen? So God can move people as he will, but ordinarily he moves by secondary causes. St. Ignatius too, his conversion. So argument 2, from sacred scripture in both the Old and the New Testament, the right and the fact of the diffusion of the church throughout the whole world is indicated. Therefore, Catholicity is a mark of the church. In the Old Testament, the Lord promised to Abraham, all the peoples of the earth shall be blessed in thy name. You see, and that's why the sacrifice of Isaac was such a tremendous act of faith on Abraham's part, that his son, who was the object of that promise, had to be sacrificed. So how is that fulfilled when I'm sacrificing my son? He is my seed. So how does this happen? And St. Paul says that he believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead. That's how he resolved it. In other words, his faith was so strong that God would raise Isaac from the dead. But it took a great act of faith, because to sacrifice at that time, you would cut the throat and then burn the whole body. Imagine doing that to your son. That took a tremendous act of faith. That was the act of faith of the Old Testament. And all of the faith, you might say, of the Old Testament rested on that foundation of Abraham. And the act of faith in the New Testament was Our Lady's fiat. Because that is actually a greater act of faith. That she would bear the Son of God. That exceeds even what Abraham went through. So that's... So in the Psalms we read, the Lord hath said to me, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee, ask of me, and I will give thee the Gentiles for thy inheritance, and the utmost parts of the earth for thy possession. See, so this was very shocking to the Jews, who thought that they would be the only people of God, you might say, the only ones that would have revelation. All of these indications of the expansion to the Gentiles was something that was mysterious to them, so much so that St. Peter would not even consider preaching to the Gentiles until he had a vision with regard to Cornelius. What I have considered clean, you will not despise. And then one of his soldiers knocked on the door just at that point. And, for Cornelius was a centurion, which meant that he was something like a captain, pretty high up in the Roman army. So he sent a soldier to get St. Peter. And Cornelius was already graced by God. In other words, he already had the faith. And he was seeking baptism and instruction, etc. So that's another case of God drawing someone as he would. He probably only heard of Christ, but he wanted to hear more. So that was a bit shocking to the Jews that the Gentiles would also be involved in teaching of God. So the prophet Isaiah says, "Lift up thy eyes round about and see, all these are gathered together, they are come to thee. Thy son shall come from afar, and thy daughters shall rise up at thy side. Then shalt thou see and abound, and thy heart shall wonder and be enlarged, when the multitude of the sea always means the Gentiles, shall be converted to thee, the strength of the Gentiles shall come to thee." When you see the sea, that refers to the Gentiles as a rule in Old Testament. You know, they regarded the Gentiles as, rightfully so, as just completely corrupt. I was listening to a book the other day about the Romans, and the Hadrian the Emperor, which was typical of generals, etc., had a boyfriend. And the boy, he had him with him in Egypt, and the boyfriend drowned in the Nile, and his wife was on the same ship. But this was considered perfectly normal in Rome. I mean, that's how corrupt they were. And that's where the Jews, Gentiles, they just had a complete disgust for the Gentiles. So that's why St. Peter, I'm supposed to preach to the Gentiles, and so but that's how they were, and then Hadrian made a god out of him, out of the drowned boyfriend. How the boyfriend drowned, I don't know, but he did. And so he made a god out of him, built a temple in Egypt to him, and made him a Roman god, and all the people in Rome were happy. That's what life was like. Yes. And on their campaigns, like Augustus was, one of those boyfriends to one of the generals, because they didn't bring their wives, so that's the way it was. So I mean, the Gentiles were really debauched, completely, dirty in every way whatsoever people, and that's why the Jews wanted nothing whatever to do with them. The Jews were respected all of the natural laws, etc. They would never engage in anything like that. See, so that's there's something to know that's what the apostles were looking at when they went into the Gentile world, converting, and that they could convert Rome from that into a Christian state is only by the grace of God and the help of God. How do you get people to abandon that? Corinth, you read the Epistle to the Corinthians, Romans, there's all sorts of references to awful things. So that was the state of the world. That's what the world, that's people sink into that without the grace of God. The effects of original sin are so severe that even your mind is affected by it, in the sense that you accept things that are obviously wrong. But we're seeing that a lot today, with the same sort of thing. So anyway, that's the Gentiles. So that was why it was so shocking to hear that. The prophet Daniel says that the kingdom of heaven appears under the figure of a stone which became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And Malachias foretells the reign of Christ with these words, "For from the rising of the sun even to the going down, my name is great among the Gentiles, and in every place there is sacrifice, and there is offered to my name a clean oblation. For my name is great among the Gentiles, saith the Lord of hosts." That refers to the holy sacrifice of the Mass. All right, and that is dogma, that is a reference to the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Again, this would be that there would be a sacrifice among the Gentiles. This is, in a way, offensive to the Jews, or it's a surprise to the Jews, let's say, because you could only do the sacrifice in Jerusalem, only by Jewish priests. So the Gentiles are going to have a sacrifice. So, and a clean oblation, that means bloodless oblation. So that's clearly referring to the sacrifice of the Mass. You can take your break.